Thank you very much, Tadeusz, and good evening, hello, good day. Welcome to everybody from around the world. My name is DJ Schneeweiss. I'm a former Israeli diplomat who's been working for the last 3 or 4 years with the National Library, helping it with its international outreach, particularly in Canada, where I served as Consul General in Toronto. During my time there, I had the pleasure of meeting our guest this evening, David Weitzner. I'll talk to you about him in just a second, but I wanted, for those for whom this may be the first time attending a National Library of Israel event, I just wanted to give sort of 2 sentences of introduction that the National Library of Israel is the central institution of national memory for Israel and all of its citizens, no matter their background and faith, all the citizens of Israel and the Jewish people as a whole. And its mission is to collect and preserve the intellectual and cultural heritage of the Jewish people and of our land, and to endow those to this and future generations. The library is often described as a meeting place between people and ideas, between generations, between cultures, and between the lived experience of the Jews and the potential that we all hold for tomorrow. And I think that's very much the spirit in which today's conversation is going to take place, a meeting of different ideas, different thoughts, and hopefully it will be enjoyable for everybody. It's my privilege to welcome David Weitzner to the National Library's platform. David is a management professor at York University in Toronto, Canada. He is the author of Connected Capitalism, How Jewish Wisdom Can Transform Work, recently announced as a 2021 Indies Book of the Year winner in the Business and Economics section. And David also runs or blogs at the Managing with Meaning blog for Psychology Today. David, welcome. And as I welcome you, I'm going to share my screen because David wanted me to put up a sign, an image that he thought would help us get the conversation started. So hold on a second. That's the wrong one. And we'll go there. And there we have it. So, David, you've chosen as your visual prompt to open the chat a picture or a drawing of Moses hitting the rock and bearing water from it. How is the story, how is Moses himself relevant to a book about or a discussion about fixing today's economy and society?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, DJ. Thank you to the National Library of Israel for having me. And thank you, DJ, for being the individual that I get to chat with, because I know we're going to have a great exchange. The reason I picked this image and why I wanted to start the conversation here is because I know there might be some of you folks in the audience who aren't all that interested in business. And when you see the topic of business and Judaism, you say, I'm not a business person, I'm not an executive, this isn't for me. But I think when we drill down to what the lessons of Judaism are for business, we see it actually in a broader sense, that really what Judaism has is a very different take on leadership, a very different take on spirituality. And the story of Moses and Moshe and the rock really struck me even at a young age. The way I was taught it in my yeshiva never sit right, When I was younger, it was sort of taught as Moshe's great sin. This is the moment where he went wrong, where he was supposed to talk to the rock. And instead he hit the rock because he was impertinent. And I thought, it doesn't stim, as they say, with the rest of what we learn about Moshe. Moshe was this amazing leader. And everything he did, one would think, would be to teach a lesson. And I think the lesson here, even as a child, I thought there was a lesson here about the difference between having things come easy and the spiritual value of work. And in fact, as I grew older and I started reading some interpretations, there's a famous discourse from one of the early Lubavitcher Rebbe's, Reb Shalom Dov Ber. He said that this whole story is actually metaphorical and that it's not really about water in the literal sense, but in fact, it's about spiritual wisdom. And Hashem, as it were, wanted spiritual wisdom to come easy. And his instruction to Moshe was, use words. When the Jewish people schmooze, spiritual wisdom will come to them. It'll be easy. And Moshe looked at his stiff-necked people and said, I have a different understanding of spirituality and spiritual wisdom. With these folks, they got to work for it. And hitting the rock with this exemplar of, you got to work. And if you don't work, it's not going to come easy. And in fact, his punishment of not being allowed to enter Israel was an extension of that, because the punishment was, you know what? You're not going to have me when you start doing the work of building the new nation. You're going to have to work for that on your own. And I found this all very powerful and inspiring. And it's really what I hope will be our discussion today, which is that Judaism has a unique take where we blend the spiritual and the physical, the sacred and the profane, work and relaxation. It all melts together into a very unique approach to life. And that's what I want to talk about today, hopefully.
Great. Well, thanks, David. So before we get into all that, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. We know you're a professor of management, but you're also a guy who clearly is able to quote the Torah, and I know that you quote the Gemara and the Zohar and all sorts of other Jewish sources. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a window into the journey of David Weitzner, the Orthodox Jew who's also a professor and a consultant in the very secular world of management and business.
Yeah, we all have our journey, right? Mine started in the yeshiva and ended up in the university. But I think to answer your question more specifically, I want to give a quote. There's a philosopher, Richard Rorty. He's a big influence of mine. And he said something very profound. He said, what's a discipline or a field? He said, a discipline or a field, just a bunch of folks who've read the same books. And they come and schmooze about those books that they've read, right? So what's a philosopher? I've read book ABC, and we come and we schmooze because we all read ABC. My background was so rooted in Judaism that I read different books. And when I came into being a professor, at the beginning of my career, I stayed true to our field, quoting Porter and the big names that everyone else has read. But I realized that when I was actually doing my teaching, my consulting, my writing, I was talking about the books I was reading. And the books I was reading weren't necessarily the same books as my colleagues were reading. And I sort of felt it was dishonest for me to not bring that explicitly to the surface. And so the motivation behind this book, Connected Capitalism, was to say, look, when I act as a consultant, I'm drawing on Hasidus philosophy as much as I am on classic strategy. And in fact, I think our field would be made better if we all read the same books. And so I wrote a book that I hope my colleagues will read, but I also hope they read the references, right? And that we all start expanding the notion of what our field should be. There's a senior individual in our field who's been very influential on me, very kind, smart man named Ed Freeman. He's viewed as, in many ways, the father of stakeholder theory. And he made an argument called rejecting the separation thesis, where he said, this notion that it's meaningful to say, okay, here's business. We're going to take our business courses, and I'm going to teach you strategy and marketing and all that. And then here's ethics. These are our ethics courses, and they're going to be separate. So it's nonsensical. You can't talk about business without incorporating ethics. And you can't talk about ethics in a practical way without talking about its implication for business, right? And I found that very inspiring. And I sort of want to push that and say, it doesn't make sense for these clear delineations between fields and disciplines. We as Jews, we have unique books that we've read. We have a unique language that we speak, and it should be part of our field.
So if you're finding that once you've read the books in your discipline, you're sort of done there, where do you go? Where do you go, David, to find sort of who do you go to learn from?
Personally, I've done a lot of learning from artists. I've done a lot of learning from rabbis. I find that anyone who I encounter, really, if they're worth the time, right, they teach you something. And so to think that it only has to be the big names in business or academic essays, it's really nonsensical. I've gained a lot of inspiration from the philosophy of Richard Rorty. I've gained a lot of inspiration from artists. When my first book was called 15 Paths, and it was me interviewing the artists that inspired me, as well as some rabbis that inspired. I interviewed my good friend, Rabbi Tzvi Freeman, a Chabad rabbi, who I found very powerful and really inspired me. And an interesting story, I think we chatted about this years ago, but I'll share it for the group, is when that book was first being pitched, some of the feedback I got was, this is a great book, we love the artist, but you got to kill the rabbi chapter. And I was very disturbed by this. I was like, what do you mean, kill the rabbi chapter? Well, you're putting a book out there about artists, about liberal values, about creativity. Can't have a rabbi in there. And that really, sort of opened my eyes, because I think that is people's natural response in our secular society, that it's odd to pair a rabbi with a rock star. And that has to change.
So we're going to get to a bit later about how the current book has been received in different circles. But I think it might be fun now to dive into the content of the book. And I'm going to share my screen again now for just a minute. And I want everybody to take a look at that. Well, that doesn't work. So just hold on a second. Sorry. I'm going to ask everybody to look at a few of these images that we've chosen here to help us. Why does it go back to that one? Okay, let's try here. If it doesn't work, there we go. Okay, so that's one of the images. I'm not gonna talk now for about 30 seconds. I'm just going to share 2 or 3 images to frame the discussion that David and I are going to have now in the next few minutes. Okay, back to the ending of the screen share. David, onto the book. It's a book and it's full of philosophy, and you basically lay out a reimagined application of central Jewish concepts, such as mitzvah, such as chavrusa, and you lay them out as solutions, unexpected solutions to the ills which plague modern business and modern society more generally. And we'll get to those details in a minute. But I want to start with what I think is a more foundational assertion that you're making, and that is that our work lives, perhaps really the most secular spaces we know, that our work lives need to be seen in a spiritual light. Tell us what you mean by that and how you get to that fundamental assertion.
Right. So, I am very comfortable with the term spirituality. And I know not everyone's comfortable with this notion of spirituality, but I think this idea is really important. And it's not just my feeling. There's data that backs it up. I don't remember the exact numbers, but they're in the book. But recent research has found that even as fewer people in the West identify as religious, something like just under 80%, or something in the mid-70s of folks identify as spiritual. So spirituality is something that motivates most people. So the interesting question then becomes, okay, if spirituality is important, if spirituality motivates people, what do we mean by that? And if you remember the first picture we put up there, which is someone being Zen on the mountain, I think that's where most folks hold today when they think of spirituality, certainly in Western society, and certainly in terms of spirituality in the workplace. When we think of efforts by big corporations to make their workspaces more spiritual, it's usually introducing mindfulness and meditation. And that's legitimate, and that's one approach to spirituality. But in Judaism, spirituality isn't just relegated to those who are up on the mountains, right? Spirituality is very much in the day-to-day, in changing the world, in tikkun olam, in doing things. And a Jewish sense of spirituality, more widely conceived, is in line with the second slide, that second image of folks doing good in a way that's very explicit, right? That fits our moral understanding. But to me, the most interesting slide, the one that I really like to discuss, and that really inspired my book, the third slide is a dude with a cherry picker in New York checking wires for the Eruv. I love that picture.
Maybe, David, explain the Eruv for those in the group who may not know exactly what that is.
Right. So in the Orthodox world, there's an understanding that we cannot carry and engage in other activities on Shabbos if we are moving from private domain to public domain. And so in order to expand the realm of a private domain, we create a somewhat artificial notion of a barrier, right? So we can suggest that a group of wires surrounding a metropolitan area is a sufficient border to consider it one large domain. And so this spiritual activity that he's engaging in is measuring wires, is making sure wires connect. It's going around in this truck. And to most of us, I think we'd look at that and we'd think that's the opposite of spiritual. And I love that image because that's really the idea that I'm trying to push with the book, is that most of us say accounting. How can accounting be spiritual? Finance, risk management, How can that be spiritual, right? That's about as mundane as it comes. But just as moving around in a cherry picker and tying up wires can be spiritual in our tradition, just as helping the poor and helping the needy and sharing food, like the second slide, can be spiritual. And just like meditation and prayer and soul activities can be spiritual. They're all in the same realm. And you know, DJ, I want to push you for a minute, right? Because of my dear friends who don't love that term spiritual, you're at the top. So why don't you out yourself here as someone who doesn't love spiritual?
Well, I'm just not sure I'm that much of a spiritual guy. And for me, bringing the notion of spirituality into the workplace, into the mundane, somehow it's sort of, I don't fully feel the connection. It doesn't motivate me in a way that perhaps it motivates others. And that's part of why I find your book interesting, because you're also quoting Pew Research that suggests that spirituality does motivate. And it doesn't only motivate older people, it's motivating younger people, which is even more sort of surprising. To me, I felt that, if you want to do a book about fixing the world, bringing spirituality into it wasn't really going to be the most effective way or the most commercially viable way to sell a book.
Yes, indeed. And, in the book, one of the people I interview is David Weitzner, the political commentator. And, he had a great line in the book where he pushed back and he said, I'm one of the few people that you're going to meet that self-identifies as religious, but not spiritual. He's in the opposite camp of the Pew folks, where he proudly identifies himself as religious, not spiritual. What's the difference, right? I think the difference is when you use religion, you're inviting God language. And as you'll note in my book, I really stay away from God language. God isn't necessary for the system that I'm pushing. In my book, I define spirituality as 3 factors: search for meaning, connection, and wonder. That's spirituality for me. For me, the spiritual pursuit is one that engages my mind, it engages my heart, the social connection, and it breaks my frame of reference. It pushes for something beyond me, which is that piece of wonder or awe. And so you'll note that definition of spirituality is not metaphysical, right? It's rooted very much in the here and now, in the day-to-day, and it can actually be a target function for a corporation. Next week, I'm gonna, God willing, be at Cambridge giving a talk. And the paper I'm presenting is literally on that. The paper that we're gonna be presenting is a paper that argues that profit-seeking, shareholder maximization is an outdated corporate target function. That the truth is, yes, corporations need to make money. We're not denying that, right? But if you think of what a corporation should strive to do, it needs to do much more than that if it's going to be successful in our political environment. And so what we're going to argue next week is that meaning, i.e. that a corporation, that work, should strive to provide the resources so that all its stakeholders can find meaning while living out the mission of the firm. Connection, relationships should be primary. And indeed, wonder, this sense of beyond, should be corporate target functions. So I'm trying to bring spirituality down to earth, and I'm trying to bring the mundane of business a little bit higher, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That's actually a great way of putting it. But I want to bring you back though to something you mentioned before. You're a little bit generous. You talked about many corporations. They're doing mindfulness. They're doing retreats and things like that. Let's be honest. In the book, David, you take these people to task very, very, quite harshly. It's quite a trenchant critique of the whole mindfulness thing, which many of us may have experienced in one work. Or either a work sort of space or even in a personal space. So where do you see the spirituality that you're arguing for? How does that differ from the spirituality that is being presented and offered sort of more broadly, perhaps?
So let's be fair, okay? So I see a lot of value in mindfulness. I myself have been a practitioner of mindfulness and meditation for almost 20 years now. I believe it's a useful tool. What's it a useful tool for? It's an excellent tool to enter a state of non-judgment. What happens when we enter a state of non-judgment? We can relax, we can be more present, we can feel more connected, all beautiful things. When I'm working, I'm judging. And so the critical lens that I bring is saying that mindfulness is a wonderful tool. Meditation is a wonderful tool, but it makes no sense to bring it to the workforce the way folks are in fact doing that today. And I start the book with a story. So I have a friend who was a senior dude at Google, and Google were one of the leaders in bringing mindfulness, right? So they had a beautiful meditation room. And the expectation is you go into the meditation room and you're Zen and you're chill and you're connected and you're non-judgmental. And then you leave and you get back to work, right? As if there's something separate. And the story I share in my book is, there was one time where he wanted to take a business call in that room because he wanted to be in that state whilst interacting with someone. And his colleagues looked at him with this thing, like, what are you doing? You're ruining the vibe in here. You can't take a call in the meditation room. This is where we're spiritual. So they were admitting that there was a disconnect between the spiritual practice and the day-to-day of their work. And he didn't get that. He's a Jewish guy. He's like, well, but I don't see the separation. This is the optimal place for me to try to connect with somebody else. And I think that's a problem with the approach today of bringing mindfulness to the workspace. Work is all about active judgment. Work is all about being reactive. Work is about doing things, right? A state of non-judgment, a state of being isn't helpful in a work context. And so we need something different. And I think Judaism offers that different.
Cool. So being versus doing, I think, is a great sort of segue to take us then into the details of some of how you use Jewish concepts in the book. So you use the concept of mitzvah, which for most of us, I think, I'm probably speaking for just about everybody on the call. For most of us, we grew up understanding mitzvah as either a commandment or a specific obligatory deed, and yet you use the concept of mitzvah in a very different, and for me at least, was a very unexpected way. So could you explain what mitzvah means to you?
Right. So mitzvah, I define in the book mitzvah as a moment of doing that creates a transformative space for being. So mitzvah is something I do, it's an action I take. But by taking that action, I'm creating a space to connect, to be, to have all those wonderful things we associate with in the more traditional sense of spirituality. And it's not really my own idea. It's drawn on a number of thinkers. In fact, I note in the book that the individual I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Tzvi Freeman, my friend, he wrote an article for Chabad noting that the root of mitzvah is the Aramaic word savta, which is about connection, to connect. And in fact, one of my mentors, Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shalomi, used to argue that translating mitzvah as a commandment doesn't really make sense nowadays. Commandment is an ugly word. We don't like that sort of top-down being commanded language. And if we believe that mitzvah is integral to our day-to-day, we need language that moves away from commandment. And in fact, even moves away from this notion of good deed, because even that is too limiting. Because if we think of mitzvah as a good deed, then we think of it as necessarily within a very narrow sense of morality. Now, I know in the Orthodox world, there's a broader understanding, right? Because halakha involves many different aspects of day-to-day life. But for most of us, good deed means, giving charity, loving your neighbor. That's a good deed. How is putting a mezuzah on the door, for example, a good deed? How is keeping kosher a good deed? And then indeed, by extension, how would risk management be a good deed? It's not what mitzvah is. Mitzvah is, I'm going to do something and I'm taking this action and I'm trying to change the world. And I have intention that I want to connect with folks, either connect with my community, with an individual. And through the action I take and through that connection, I want to elicit transformation. Change is going to happen because of what I'm doing. And that to me, what a mitzvah is.
I get it. And I we talked about this when we were preparing for tonight's conversation. I get it. But again, where, you said it earlier, where's God? Where's the religion? If you define mitzvah so broadly, it's not a mitzvah anymore.
Right. So again, in this philosophy, a mitzvah in the technical sense obviously has God behind it, right? A mitzvah by definition is one of the 613 actions that God tells us to take or not to take, right? Because there's positive mitzvahs and negative mitzvah. So the root, obviously, of mitzvah is deeply tied to God language. But my objective with this book isn't to proselytize. I don't want folks to convert to Judaism in order to enact this. And so in my mind, a secular interpretation of mitzvah takes the notion behind it. So we take away God. God is essential to Judaism. God is essential to religious practice. But we can take this concept that's unique to Judaism that says we have this untranslatable idea because it's not a commandment. It's not a good deed. It's something else. There is no English equivalent for mitzvah. So we got to take this idea and bring it to the secular world because we need people to recognize that their day-to-day jobs, their transformative activities can be a mitzvah. You know, we talked about, you know, how is risk management a mitzvah? Depends what you do with it, right? If my expertise is in risk management, because I'm part of a firm that wants to launch an innovative product, and I know that this product will change the world for the better, but I have to convince the finance guys, I have to convince my shareholders, I have to convince the money people. And the only language they don't speak the language of meaning, connection, and wonder. They speak the language of dollars. So I got to sit down and figure out how to calculate a risk profile, how to present these variables to convince them. That's a mitzvah, right? If I'm doing that, that's a mitzvah in my mind. But cool. I don't know. You don't need to agree.
No, that's good. I'm good. I'm happy just to be a platform to help you share your ideas. But let's move on then and see how you bring then the concept of chavrusa, how I learned it, chavruta, into the same space. So where you turn, again, a concept, you'll explain it, but again, taking something from a very Jewish environment and deploying it in what is effectively a very, you know, non-religious and non-Jewish environment.
Right. Chavrusa, I think, is, again, it's a very powerful idea, chavrusa, because we have an idea in the secular world of cooperation, of partnership, of working together. But we also have this idea tied to it of like team player, right? What's a team player? A team player is somebody who compromises themselves, right? That's what we think about in the secular world, that if you're a good team player, if you're part of the team, you take away part of yourself to do what's right for the team. We don't have this idea of chavrusa. Chavrusa says, we're going to push back. We're going to work together. We're going to argue. We're going to wrestle with a text, and we're going to love each other throughout it. And
maybe David, also again, just give a quick background for those who don't exactly know or haven't experienced a chavrusa themselves.
Right. So chavrusa, if you walk into a yeshiva, you'll see a chavrusa. Chavrusa is paired learning, where they have a text in front of them, and they argue back and forth. And there's this notion that the best way to achieve the optimal outcome, which is an intellectual breakthrough, is through this relationship that blends both the intellectual and the personal. So in order to be in a chavrusa, you have to love your chavrusa. Chavrusa is our friendship, right? There's a personal relationship element there. And that personal relationship leads to a feeling of safety. And that safety empowers folks to push back, to argue, to really, push boundaries in a way that's somewhat uncomfortable, I think, to the contemporary Western mind. When we think of a safe space today in the workspace, it's about being very careful with what you say. It's about being careful to sensitivities. It's about censoring yourself, right? A safe place is one where I'm not made to feel uncomfortable. But in a chavrusa, you are meant to feel uncomfortable. You're meant to feel uncomfortable because what's most important is the outcome. And you're safe in feeling uncomfortable because you know there's friendship, you know there's love, you know there's support. We need to bring that to the business world. We need to be comfortable using the language of friendship when we talk about cooperative activities in the business world. When you go to work, it should be fair to say, I'm working with my friend, and I'm not uncomfortable to call them a friend, because by calling them a friend, I can push them in a way that maybe I couldn't push if we had the boundaries up.
Interesting. Is this, I mean, how does this scan with what's often termed co-creation these days, which is sort of sounds to me like, okay, we're going to work together, but, eventually one of us is going to be in charge, because we all know that somebody has to be in charge. But nevertheless, there's this sort of facade of we're going to create together. Is that what you're describing, that it should be?
Yeah, I believe in co-creation.
Huh? Sorry?
Yeah, I'm a strong advocate for co-creation. I think co-creation is really important. I think it's this idea that, we come together, and rather than manage, which sounds top down, right? Rather than this hierarchical relationship, we recognize that all of us are needed, and we all have our part to play, and we all have to work together to co-create for our outcomes.
Okay, I think there was one thing in your book which you haven't mentioned it, but I'm going to quote it because it struck me as being a really powerful sort of summary of the whole thesis. You said, creating value, initiating change, and encouraging large-scale cooperation is the most important type of spiritual work. And it seems to me that you're creating this synthesis between our spiritual or our lofty sort of selves and our mundane selves, our practical selves, but you're imbuing that practicality with a sort of a higher purpose.
Yes, and I think that's the main message, I think, of Judaism, right? I think the main message of Judaism is we got to get out there and work for change. And the biggest change is on the grandest scale. The notion of being a light unto nations, the bigger the scale of change, the better off we are as people. And we need to be ambitious in our spiritual pursuits. Our spiritual pursuits can't be limited to the yeshiva. They can't be limited to our meditative space. They can't be limited to our private selves, but they need to be public, and they need to be grandiose, and they need to be transformative. So
how is this, as this is sort of a Jewish spiritual approach, how is this different to what we would normally call Jewish business ethics? Because often, at least when I was growing up, the idea of the Jewish relevance to business was about being ethical. But you're saying something else.
I think that Jewish business ethics historically limited itself to the realm of halacha. And so again, we come back to what we talked about earlier, this notion of the God language, the notion of tradition, and limiting ourselves to that which has happened in the past. I think what we need to think about today is what works in our more contemporary environment. And so we face challenges and struggles that were beyond even the scope of the imagination of folks 100, 200, let alone 1,000 years ago. And I think that's where we have to bring the energy of Judaism today, right? To that bigger picture.
Yeah, so maybe what you're saying is sort of the Jewish business ethics is like the sort of the floor. There's a minimum of behavior that we shouldn't go below, right? But you're actually offering us a view towards the ceiling, saying we've got to sort of shoot for the stars.
It's aspirational. That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Aspirational.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So cool. So we've all got an idea now what you said in your book, more or less, although I do recommend to everybody to read it. It is an interesting and sort of at times challenging, but always surprising and enjoyable read. But I want to talk to you now, David, about how the book has been received. Because, it's a sort of a hybrid kind of book. So it sort of addresses different audiences. And I wanted to start with asking how it was received, if you like, by Jewish audiences, by Jewish reviewers and so on.
Thank God it's been very well received in the secular world. It has not gotten much attention in the Jewish world, and that's okay, But what's interesting is I find when I speak to Jewish folks, they seem uncomfortable with the idea of bringing their language to the workspace. Even folks who proudly self-identify as Jewish are uncomfortable with bringing mitzvah to their workspace, are uncomfortable with the word chavrusa. They don't feel good using the Jewish language in their professional spaces. So I'm proud that the book has reached a broader audience. I'm proud that non-Jewish people are very interested in the topics and are comfortable embracing the words. And I hope, and I'm optimistic that in time, perhaps Jewish folks can themselves be as proud of their own language and their own tradition and their own concepts, and as quick to embrace them as they may be to embrace the language of Zen Buddhism or some other traditions which are not their own.
It's interesting because, in my work, sort of like, on the PR front lines for Israel through the years and so on, you often encounter, you encounter always a mix of people who are very passionate about their views and so on. But you also find those who aren't equipped. I remember I've been so many times. I've been to various campuses, not in the last few years, but I'm sure it's just as bad, if not worse, these days, where you see young people who they're not really versant in their own cultural language, where sort of to admit that sort of, I don't know, dinner on a Friday night or whatever it might be, any piece of the Jewish cultural thing, as soon as it became something that they had to sort of insist on, that separated them from the general group, that was something that made some of them uncomfortable. So do you think it's a matter of like knowledge, or it's I don't know, identity? How would you relate then to the idea that a book that was celebrating a Jewish offer, a Jewish contribution to helping fix what is clearly a world in trouble, how do you explain the sort of the reticence of people not embrace it?
I don't want to, play psychologist, I can't speak for other people. I do find that there's a comfort, at least in the North American Jewish community that I'm aware of, when I see students on campus, there's a comfort bringing up Israel. Okay, there's a comfort tying your Jewish identity to the politics of Israel, to the state of Israel, left and right, pro and right, they're very comfortable. There's a comfort amongst those who identify as religious to bring their religion to the public space. The resistance comes in the middle ground between that, right? So folks, I find, are less comfortable bringing their identity to a secular workspace, to a secular classroom, outside of the politics of Israel, or outside of saying, I need the following accommodation because, let's say I'm religious, I'm Sabbath observant, etc. I think, and again, this is speculation, I think it has to do with our particular political moment, right? We live in a moment where identity is very central. The question of identity is dominant. And so our Zionist identity or anti-Zionist identity is one we're happy to bring to the table. Our religious identity, to the extent that we need accommodation or not, we're comfortable bringing to the table. But for Jewish folks, they're uncomfortable, again, in a limited sphere, in a limited range of my experience, they're less comfortable celebrating that identity outside of that context, right? So they're less comfortable coming in and saying, just as we're here to lift up in Canada, we talk a lot about lifting up Aboriginal voices. In the North America in general, there's a conversation around bringing up Black voices who've been marginalized, right? There's a discomfort in raising their own voices, partially because there's a feeling that, at least on campus with students I encounter, they find they haven't been marginalized in the same way. We can debate whether they have or haven't, we're parking whether this is empirically valid as an observation, park that, right? But the feeling does seem to be that there's a discomfort screaming out and celebrating and lifting their Jewish identity because they feel, at least in the popular narrative, that Jews have had a certain sense of privilege. And so they're uncomfortable pushing Jewish words, et cetera, in that context. Religion, yes. Politics, yes. Did that make sense, DJ, or am I just blabbering?
Yeah, it does, but I think it actually, what it does for me is it leads me to another question. And that's about the pushback that you've got, because I know that the book has also hit some headwinds, and I wanted you, because I think you've taken yourself towards that, of the sort of the dominant ideas out there that are not necessarily about sort of all being friends. They're sort of and working together. There's a different atmosphere out there in the even in the corporate world, but certainly in the academic world. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
If you Google me, you'll find I wrote an article for Tablet magazine not too long ago. And the article had a clickbait sort of title. And the title was, Allyship is not a Jewish concept, okay? And that was meant to draw folks in. But what the article argued, which I truly believe is accurate, is that allyship as it's conveyed today isn't a Jewish concept. Because allyship as it's conveyed today says that if you want to be a good ally, you have to quiet yourself. You have to censor yourself. You have to put yourself to the side. And Judaism has a proud history of celebrating social justice. And our approach to social justice was the opposite of that. You know, in Judaism, we never quiet voices. We yell and we're loud and we argue and we scream at each other. And we do that because we love each other. And we do that because we want to lift each other up. And so, you know, it's really interesting to go out in the world. And we alluded to it when we talked about the chavrusa thing, right? What's a safe space today? You know, I just talked about it on Shabbos. You know, I was at a friend's house for Shabbos meal yesterday. And I said, you know, what's absolutely unique as an experience that I have is I will sit around the Shabbos table as an Orthodox Jew with, and I'm being colorful deliberately here, with nutcases, okay? There will be people at my Shabbos table who will espouse insane right-wing views. There will be people at my Shabbos table who will espouse insane left-wing views, and we'll yell at each other and we'll call each other crazy, and then we'll smile and say l'chaim, right? Because it's okay. We're allowed to argue. We're allowed to feel different, and I feel safe in that environment. And, you know, we brought that up because there was a view being expressed that was absolutely insane, right? And I thought, in no other world would this happen, okay? I wouldn't go to work and sit at a table and listen to someone espouse a view that I found so offensive. It doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because we don't feel safe, right? So a safe space, you know, in the public conception is one where you're not made to feel uncomfortable and you need to be protected because there isn't the trust, there isn't the love, et cetera, right? Judaism says a safe space is one where we know we support each other. And when we know we support each other, then we can center all voices. We never need to silence one another. We never need to silence anybody. We can lift everybody up. And it's a very different paradigm. So when I wrote the article, the intent wasn't to say that we shouldn't be allies. You know, there are marginalized folks who need us to lift them up, but it's a question of method. How do we best lift people up? And just like I think that mitzvah is a better approach to spirituality in the workplace than meditation, because it's about being proactive and doing things, I similarly think a better way to be an ally is to be loud, is to be vocal, is to never privilege shame. Bring your privilege to the table, talk about it, and listen too. You know, it's something we missed in our discussion of chavrusa. One of the nice ideas of chavrusa is you listen as intensely as you speak, right? So I don't doubt, you know, when I have disagreements sometimes with colleagues when we discuss this issue, I don't disagree that sometimes in my classroom, white male voices are louder than brown female voices, right? That happens. I agree that that happens. And I agree that we need to do what we can in that classroom to make sure that brown female voices are lifted and heard as frequently as the other voices. But I don't think it's helpful to get there by walking into the classroom and saying, if you're white and male, you have privilege. And if you have privilege, I don't want to hear you in this classroom. That's not helpful, right? There's a way to manage that in an open and supportive environment. So we lift people up without necessarily pushing anybody down.
So to me, David, this sounds like you've written the sort of the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed, for all those corporations and all those university administrations that are busy dealing with all of this sort of aggressive sort of attempt to shut down anybody who doesn't sort of kowtow to the very hard progressive agenda. I mean, you know, is there an offer here in the book for people to seek guidance? Is there a practical sort of dimension to it? Do you feel you could walk into a boardroom and help a company, you know, succeed in this rather turbulent environment?
That's the point of the book. You know, the point of the book is to offer a methodology. And if we can come half full circle, right? Let's come back to that definition of spirituality. Let's come back to this idea of meaning, connection, and wonder. Because I think if those were our driving target functions, our approach to business, our approach to the boardroom, and our approach to politics in the classroom would be so much different. How do we improve connection if I tell you I don't want to hear from you because you're a white male? How do we pursue wonder if we're so confident in the rightness of our view, right? What does wonder mean? Wonder is such a beautiful idea. Wonder happens when our frames of sense-making are broken. Wonder is, wow. You know, you hear this idea like, wow, I need a minute to assimilate that. oftentimes in today's political environment, individuals are so assured of their rightness that they never experience wonder. They never stop and say, whoa, I'm listening to you. I'm hearing you. My mind is blown. And now I'm going to shut up for a minute because I got to process that, right? And that's what I want to see happening. I don't want to tell the white guys in my room to shut up because they're white. I want the ideas we share in the classroom to be so powerful that that shuts them up. And they reflect and they say, wow, and they assimilate and they think, and then they come to the table and we grow. And there's a method. And you know, let's bring it back. That method is through mitzvah. It's by getting out there and doing things. That method is through chavrusa. It's by not being afraid to call your colleague a friend, right? There's a methodology there. That method is through leadership. Let's come back to that first slide, okay?
I was going to get there at the end, but okay.
Take me there.
No, there are a couple of questions from the audience that I thought I would open it up to. We've got a few comments.
Please.
And we'll get to that final question about leadership at the end, David. But we have a comment from Avram Miller, who's said, David, you're in good company. Every giant in Jewish history, including Rambam and the Baal Shem Tov, were initially rejected by the conservative majority and then later elevated to the heights of admiration. So that's a really encouraging piece of feedback. But I'm going to ask the first question from Michal Perlmutter, who's asking, can the spiritual approach you're talking about be applied to other than white-collar professions?
100%. And in fact, what I try to push when I'm out there is that this is the way to empower those in the, I'll say, blue-collar working class environment. And I'm going to give you a very specific example, right? When I go out and talk to executives and I push this idea of co-creation, one of the questions they ask always is they say, well, you know, I'm a 30-year executive. I have my MBA. Are you telling me that the blue-collar worker in my office, I need to listen to them? That the minimum wage worker, I need to listen to them? And the answer is yes. And I'm going to give you, as they say in the yeshiva world, a maisa shahaya, right? A story that actually happened that really, I think, can solidify this, right? So, you know, in our MBA program, we had instead of a thesis, the students had to go out there and do a consulting project, a real world consulting project, right? And so for this consulting project, they went to this company and they interviewed all the top level executives. And then they came back and spoke to the high-minded professors and they did their research and they crunched their numbers and they came up with a recommendation. And the recommendation was your business will be so much more successful if you buy this piece of machinery, okay? Company made the investment, not an insubstantial amount of money, to buy the piece of machinery. Truck pulls up, guess what? The piece of machinery does not fit in the loading docks, okay? They didn't speak to anyone on the floor. They didn't speak to anyone in shipping. They didn't speak to anyone in receiving. They only spoke to the executive, okay? These executives were so detached from the reality of the physical structure of their business that they came up with this whole plan that couldn't be enacted. Every person in the organization matters. Blue collar, white collar, you know, new, old, etc. Everyone has a piece to play in co-creation. That doesn't mean we discount experience, right? That doesn't mean we say they're all equal, but we need to hear everyone's voices. Now, I think the other side of the question, because maybe I skipped it, is if your work is more, and I say this without judgment, I say it in a technical sense, if your work is more mundane, can you find meaning, connection, and wonder in it? And again, the answer is yes. And I have the data behind that. You know, whether your job is as a cashier, whether your job is sweeping floors, if you approach the job from that sense of, how can I build connection? How can I find change? How can I, you know, enact transformative moments? I mean, we all know the real power is often with those individuals who are the face of the organization, the people that you first see when you walk through a door. So, you know, a clerk in a shop has more power for enacting meaning and connection in my mind than the shop's owner who's not there. So I do think that if you dive into the book, I think the practical advice given is equally built for those in the blue collar world as in the white collar world.
So we have another question which relates to the work environment. It comes at it from a slightly different angle though, from Alessandro Alio. How is this applied? How is your philosophy, your ideas, how can they be applied to ego and aggressive behaviors in business?
The short answer is the long answer, okay? It's what we're going to be talking about in Cambridge next week. The fastest way to get there is to jump to the end of that talk, which is this. Meaningful work, that's not new. We've always had meaningful work. We know that it matters, okay? Connection in work, that's not new. We've always known that there's still connections and relationships, and they're important. Folks who pursue meaning can still be greedy jackasses, okay? Folks who pursue connection can still equally be problematic, so they can choose to build relationship with other problematic people. This is where we need wonder, that third tier, because that's what's missing. Research in psychology has shown that when we embrace wonder, when we're curious, when we're open to having our mental frames broken, we start to think more about the collective and less about ourselves. Greed as a physical, well, I don't want to say physical, but greed as a materially identified driver diminishes, and this is from psychological research, diminishes with those people who experience awe and wonder in their workplace. So the long, short answer is that if we take spirituality seriously, which means not just the pursuit of meaning, not just connection, but recognizing that in our work environment, we need this message of wonder. We need to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone and outside our normal frames of reference and challenge ourselves and silence ourselves. That may be the best path to breaking this trend towards greed. The other thing I'll note, which is a less pretty answer, but we talk about it in the book, the next generation have zero patience for it. So the optimistic answer is let's embrace wonder and get there. The cynical and ugly answer is that greed and egoism as a primary virtue is dying out in the business world. The younger workers, the next generation, the Generation Z and the millennials have less of that. And we are seeing a generational shift in the workplace. And it's ugly right now because there's often a conflict between the old school of ego and money and selfishness. And the young folks are saying, no, I need more. I need meaning and connection in my workspace. And that's why you see the Great Resignation. That's why you see a lot of companies struggling to keep their workers, because there's a battle going on. And I think it's on the side of the less greedy to win.
Cool. So we have two more quick questions. We've only got 5 minutes to go. But from Austin Science, do you consider the Haredi way of life? Do you think it can play any part in your approach?
Some of my biggest mentors and best friends are of the Haredi world. And I think that there's a lot of beauty in the Haredi world. Most of my learning was done I'm a product, in fact, of a Haredi education. I went to, Yeshivas Eitz Chaim for my upbringing. It's funny to have this discussion today because, as I'm sure most of you know, there was that expose this morning in the New York Times on the Haredi education system in New York City. And I think what makes me sad about that expose, because we all know that reality, all of us in this world know that what they're saying is exactly accurate. What makes me sad about it is when you see the defenders of the yeshiva education that denies any sort of secular education, their message is actually the opposite of mine, right? Because my message says, hey, it's a mistake for those who believe in rigorous science and math and finance, et cetera, to not also create a space for Torah. That's a mistake. But the flip side of saying everything I need to know in the Talmud is in the Talmud, and I don't need math and science, it's not right. It's not true. It's not accurate. And so, my best partnerships are with Haredi folks who have that brilliant, deep dedication to traditional textual sources, but are open and have a chavrusa with me, and I've been very grateful for that. I mean, I've had chavrusa with folks who you think would not want to go to a guy with long hair, but they're open. So when there's an openness and a connection, I think it's beautiful. When we close our doors, it becomes much more problematic.
Thanks, David. There are a couple more comments, and maybe just give a quick answer to these from one of the people in the audience whom I know, how can David's common sense be brought back into workspaces and the campuses? Well, we've only got like 3 minutes to answer that. And another question from Doug Dalgleish is whether you can include spiritual elements or sort of societal spirituality like Eastern philosophies. Do you include them in what you approach, what you advocate for, or is it solely Jewish wisdom that you look to apply?
So yes, and happy to both. Okay. To the first question, I am very optimistic about campuses. The truth is, over a long term, I'm cynical in the near term, but optimistic in the long term. I teach in a very diverse university, and I have Muslim students and Hindu students and Christian students who read my book because it's a required text in the course I teach, and they've responded wonderfully to it. And so I think it's quite beautiful in the individual setting of a classroom to watch these interactions take place. A lot of what's unfortunate in the university today, I think more comes from the administrative side of things. You know, just really quickly, you'll find this on Twitter. Jonathan Kay tweeted out a few days ago how at the University of Michigan, there were 168 DEI executives in the university, right? And so I think that there's a lot of pressure coming down because of people who've created jobs and power for themselves. But I think at the individual classroom level, students are still curious and hungry and want to know. And if they're exposed to open ideas, they're open to the ideas. The second question was, remind me.
Eastern philosophies.
Right, yes, 100% a place. You know, my mentor, Reb Zalman, I think said it best. He taught me that he believes spirituality can use the metaphor of the human body, and that each tradition is a different organ. So, you know, one tradition might be the heart, one might be the liver, one might be the hand. And indeed, I think we can and should draw on a multitude of traditions, but Jewish folks should be privileging Jewish tradition. So expose yourself to Hindu tradition, Christian tradition, bring it back to your Jewish frame, and vice versa. When I talk to my Christian friends, again, I don't want them to be Jewish. I want them to take these Jewish ideas to bring it to their Christian practices. That's great.
So I want to go back to how we started, and it also relates to one of the comments that came in the chat. I used the term co-creation, and I was a bit cynical when I suggested that may be a tool that some managers use to sort of make as if they're offering their staff a sort of an equal say in things, but you know, it may still be a power play. On the other hand, genuine co-creation obviously is something that is collegial and it is done equitably. My question to you, though, to finish off, David, and we've got like a minute and a half, leadership. You started with Moses and you talked about leadership, and then you spent a lot of time talking about the value of the individual and the sort of bringing a sacred spiritual dimension to work. How is a manager, how is a leader, a CEO or a director of this company or that institution, or how are these people meant to absorb what you're saying and still lead and still take the critical decisions that can't be collegial at the end of the day because there are never enough resources to do everything you want to do?
My mantra on that is that we need to put our emphasis on leading as a verb and not leader as a noun, which is to say, we still need leadership. There's no question that we need leadership, right? And at the end of the day, we need one person sometimes to make the decision, to say, you know, that's it, argument's done, this is what we're moving forward. But there's a difference between saying, I'm leading, and I recognize that those who I am leading support my ability to lead. And so I need to do my best to bring them up with me. And the old egotistical approach says, I'm the leader, I know what I'm doing, be quiet. Now, just as a sad aside, I know we have 20 seconds, I'll be really fast. Studies have shown, and I say this to my students, if you're really evil, you can take my ethics class, learn these tools and use them cynically, right? Because you can pretend to listen, you can pretend to care and buy yourself some time. But over the long term, 8 to 10 year long term, authenticity rules. And you can't BS the people over the long term.
David, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I've enjoyed the chat. I hope everybody on the call has enjoyed it too. I think you'll all agree with me that my friend David Weitzner is an interesting guy. He's got some challenging ideas and some creative ideas, and it's great to be able to share them with the audience. And we thank NLI for offering this opportunity to host an interesting, engaging Jewish thinker who is active in the wider world, bringing Jewish wisdom to our secular spaces. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for all the generous comments in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you at the next NLI event. Thanks a lot. Good evening, good day. Have a great week. All the best.
Thank you.